Greg was not your typical tourist. He wasn't the kind who carried guidebooks, snapped thoughtful photos of landmarks, or listened intently to historical tours. No, Greg fancied himself a free spirit, someone who traveled to have fun and live in the moment. Unfortunately, his idea of fun often involved bending or outright breaking the rules. This time, he had landed in a small European country known for its stunning castles, charming villages, and most importantly, its deep reverence for its royal family. The kingdom had a rich history that stretched back centuries. Its people took immense pride in their monarchy, which symbolized unity, tradition, and honor. At the heart of this pride were the royal guards, tall, imposing figures dressed in vibrant uniforms with shiny helmets and solemn expressions. They stood like statues outside palaces, museums, and other significant sites, embodying discipline and loyalty. Tourists flocked from all over the world just to see them, marveling at how they remained perfectly still, no matter what happened around them. But Greg wasn't interested in admiring the guards. To him, they represented an opportunity to test their limits, to see if he could crack their stoic demeanor. As soon as he arrived in the bustling capital city, he began wandering through its cobblestone streets, camera slung carelessly over his shoulder. His first stop, the Grand Palace, where crowds gathered daily to catch a glimpse of the royal guards. As Greg approached the palace gates, he couldn't help but roll his eyes at the seriousness of it all. People whispered in hushed tones, pointing respectfully at the guards while snapping pictures from a distance. Some even bowed slightly before moving on. But Greg, he snickered under his breath. "What's the big deal?" he muttered to himself. "They're just standing there. It's not like they're doing anything important." He moved closer to one particular guard stationed near the entrance. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform immaculate down to the last button. His posture was perfect, his face expressionless. Not a single muscle twitched, even as children giggled nearby or pigeons flapped past his polished boots. Greg tilted his head, studying the guard curiously. "How do you stay so still?" he wondered aloud, though more mockingly than genuinely. "Do you even blink?" A sly grin spread across Greg's face as an idea formed in his mind. What would happen if he tried to provoke the guard? Would the man react? Or would he continue to stand there like a statue, unmoving and unbothered? Greg's curiosity quickly turned into mischief, and he scanned the area for something, anything, he could use to stir up trouble. That's when he spotted it. A scruffy little dog trotting along the edge of the crowd. The mutt looked harmless enough, wagging its tail and sniffing around for scraps dropped by tourists. Greg's eyes lit up. Perfect, he thought, already envisioning the chaos he could create. Little did he know, this seemingly harmless prank would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. The stage was set. The guard stood firm, unaware of the storm about to unfold. And Greg, fueled by boredom and arrogance, stepped forward, ready to play his game. Greg's eyes sparkled with mischief as he watched the stray dog sniffing around near the palace gates. The scruffy mutt was small but energetic, its tail wagging furiously as it darted between tourists, hoping for a crumb of food or a kind pat on the head. To most people, the dog was just another harmless creature adding charm to the lively scene. But to Greg, it was the perfect accomplice in his plan to stir up some fun. He crouched down slowly, making sure not to startle the dog. With a grin, he picked up a stick lying nearby and waved it teasingly in front of the animal. At first, the dog hesitated, tilting its head as if trying to understand what this strange man wanted. But when Greg tapped the ground with the stick a few times, the dog's curiosity got the better of it. Its ears perked up, and it began barking playfully, jumping toward the stick with excitement. "Good boy," Greg said under his breath, chuckling to himself. He tossed the stick a short distance away, and the dog eagerly chased after it, bringing it back moments later with unmistakable enthusiasm. The crowd around him barely noticed. They were too busy admiring the grandeur of the palace or snapping photos of the royal guards. No one paid any attention to Greg, or so he thought. Feeling emboldened, Greg decided it was time to take things up a notch. He pointed the stick directly at the guard standing motionless a few feet away. "Hey, buddy," he whispered mockingly to the dog. "See that guy over there? Go get him." Then, with a flick of his wrist, he threw the stick again. But this time, he aimed it close to the guard's polished boots. The dog didn't hesitate. It bolted forward, barking loudly as it raced toward the unsuspecting guard. Tourists turned their heads, startled by the sudden commotion. Some laughed nervously, thinking the dog was simply being playful. Others frowned, unsure why someone would encourage such behavior near a symbol of national pride. Greg leaned against a nearby lamppost, arms crossed, watching with growing amusement. The dog reached the guard and immediately began circling him, barking and jumping excitedly. When the stick landed near the guard's feet, the dog lunged forward, attempting to grab it. But instead of retrieving the stick, the dog accidentally nipped at the guard's boot, causing a ripple of gasps from the onlookers. Still, the guard remained perfectly still, refusing to acknowledge the dog or the increasing chaos around him. His face betrayed no emotion, not even a flicker of irritation. This only fueled Greg's laughter. He pulled out his phone and started recording the scene, zooming in on the guard's stoic expression while the dog continued its antics. "Come on, big guy," Greg taunted quietly, though loud enough for those closest to hear. "You're not gonna move, huh? Let's see how long you can hold that pose." Tourists began whispering among themselves, pointing fingers at Greg. A young mother scolded her child for laughing, explaining that the guard deserved respect. An elderly man shook his head disapprovingly, muttering something about disgraceful behavior. But none of this registered with Greg. He was too caught up in his own amusement, relishing the absurdity of the situation. Unbeknownst to him, however, palace security had already taken notice. 2 officers stationed nearby exchanged concerned glances before discreetly moving closer to assess the scene. They observed Greg's actions carefully, noting how deliberately he seemed to be provoking both the dog and the guard. One of them spoke into a radio, calling for backup. Meanwhile, the dog showed no signs of calming down. It barked louder, leaping repeatedly at the guard's legs. The once serene atmosphere outside the palace gates had transformed into a chaotic spectacle, all because of Greg's reckless idea of entertainment. And as the murmurs of disapproval grew louder, Greg failed to realize that his so-called prank was about to spiral far beyond his control. The chaos outside the palace gates was escalating, but Greg remained oblivious to the growing tension around him. He was too busy enjoying the spectacle he had created, laughing as the scruffy dog continued its relentless assault on the royal guard. The guard, for his part, stood like a statue carved from stone, unmoving and unflinching despite the barking, jumping, and occasional nips at his boots. His composure was remarkable, but it only fueled Greg's amusement. "Wow, this guy's got patience," Greg muttered to himself, smirking as he filmed the scene. "Let's see how much longer he can keep this up." He tossed the stick again, deliberately aiming closer to the guard's feet. The dog lunged forward once more, barking louder than ever, its tail wagging with wild excitement. To Greg, it was all just a game, a harmless bit of fun meant to pass the time. But to everyone else watching, it was something entirely different. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably. Some tourists turned away in disgust, while others whispered angrily among themselves. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, her face red with frustration. "Sir," she called out sharply, pointing at Greg, "what you're doing is completely disrespectful. Stop it right now." Her voice carried over the noise, drawing even more attention to Greg's antics. Greg froze mid-laugh, startled by the sudden confrontation. For a moment, he considered ignoring her and continuing his prank. But then he noticed the disapproving stares from the people around him. Parents pulled their children closer, shielding them from what they clearly saw as a bad example. Even the vendors selling souvenirs nearby paused their work, shaking their heads in disbelief. Before Greg could respond, another voice cut through the commotion. That's enough. It belonged to one of the palace security officers who had been observing silently until now. The man, dressed in a crisp uniform, strode toward Greg with an air of authority that demanded respect. Behind him, another officer appeared, his expression stern as he surveyed the scene. Greg straightened up, suddenly feeling less confident. "What's the problem?" he asked defensively, trying to sound casual. "It's just a dog. No big deal." "No big deal," the officer repeated, his tone icy. "You're disturbing public order and showing blatant disrespect for our traditions. Do you have any idea how serious this is?" Greg shrugged, attempting to downplay the situation. "Relax, okay? It's not like I hurt anyone." The guard didn't even flinch. "That's not the point," the officer snapped. "These guards represent honor, discipline, and loyalty. Not just to us, but to our entire nation. What you've done here is unacceptable." By now, a small group of onlookers had gathered, murmuring their agreement with the officer's words. Someone shouted, "Teach him a lesson." Another added, "He should be ashamed of himself." The weight of their collective disapproval pressed down on Greg, making him squirm under their judgmental gazes. As if sensing the seriousness of the situation, the stray dog finally calmed down, retreating a few steps away from the guard. Its playful energy faded, replaced by confusion, as it looked back and forth between Greg and the tense crowd. Even the animal seemed to realize that something wasn't right. The second officer stepped forward, addressing the guard directly. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked respectfully. The guard gave a slight nod, never breaking his stance or betraying any emotion. Satisfied, the officer turned back to Greg, his expression hardening. "Come with us," he ordered firmly. "Now." Greg hesitated, glancing nervously between the two officers and the growing crowd. He opened his mouth to protest, but the look in their eyes silenced him instantly. Reluctantly, he followed them as they led him away from the palace gates, leaving behind a trail of angry whispers and disappointed faces. As they walked, Greg couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his stomach. What had started as a silly prank was quickly spiraling out of control, and for the first time, he began to wonder if he had gone too far. Greg's heart pounded as the two palace security officers escorted him through a side entrance of the Grand Palace, away from the prying eyes of the crowd. The ornate doors swung shut behind them with a heavy thud, muffling the murmurs of disapproval that had followed him moments earlier. For the first time since arriving in the country, Greg felt truly uneasy. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. The corridor they walked through was quiet and dimly lit, lined with portraits of past monarchs whose stern gazes seemed to follow him. Greg couldn't help but feel like he was being judged, not just by the officers, but by the very history embedded in these walls. Each step echoed ominously, amplifying his growing anxiety. Where were they taking him? What would happen next? They finally stopped outside a plain wooden door marked Security Office. One of the officers opened it and gestured for Greg to enter. Inside, the room was small but functional, with a desk cluttered with papers, a computer humming softly, and chairs arranged neatly against the wall. A third officer sat behind the desk, looking up expectantly as they entered. "Sit," one of the escorts commanded, pointing to a chair opposite the seated officer. Greg obeyed without protest, sinking into the seat while trying to appear calm. But his fidgeting hands betrayed his nerves. The seated officer leaned forward slightly, studying Greg with an unreadable expression before speaking. "We've reviewed the situation," he began in a measured tone, "and we need you to explain yourself. Why did you incite that dog to harass our royal guard?" Greg swallowed hard, searching for words that might soften the gravity of his actions. "Look, I didn't mean any harm," he started hesitantly. It was just supposed to be a joke. I thought it'd be funny." "A joke?" the officer repeated, raising an eyebrow. His voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now. You think mocking the symbol of national pride is funny. Our guards are trained to protect this country and its traditions. They represent centuries of honor and service. And you treated them like entertainment. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. I didn't know it was such a big deal, he mumbled lamely. Back home, people don't take stuff like this so seriously. That's no excuse, the officer replied firmly. When you visit another country, you're expected to respect their customs and values. Ignorance doesn't absolve you of responsibility. At that moment, the door opened again, and a fourth figure entered, a senior official dressed in formal attire, carrying a folder filled with documents. He introduced himself as part of the royal administration and wasted no time getting straight to the point. Your actions have caused significant offense, he said gravely. This isn't just about one guard. It's about how you've disrespected our entire nation. He placed the folder on the desk and flipped it open, revealing printed screenshots of social media posts already circulating online. Someone had captured video footage of Greg throwing the stick and laughing as the dog attacked the guard. The clip had gone viral within hours, sparking outrage across the country and beyond. Comments poured in from locals and international viewers alike, condemning Greg's behavior as disrespectful and disgraceful. This is serious, the official continued, tapping the folder for emphasis. The royal family has been informed, and they've requested immediate action. You'll face legal consequences for your actions. Greg's stomach churned at the word legal. He had never imagined things would escalate this far. What kind of consequences? He asked weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. You'll be fined heavily, the officer explained. And depending on further review, deportation, and possibly even a lifetime ban from entering this country, may follow. The weight of those words hit Greg like a punch to the gut. He slumped back in his chair, staring blankly at the floor. This wasn't just some minor scolding anymore. It was real, tangible punishment. As the reality of his situation sank in, Greg realized he had made a grave mistake, one that might haunt him for years to come. Outside the office, the palace remained majestic and serene, untouched by the turmoil unfolding inside. But for Greg, the illusion of carefree travel had shattered completely. Now, all he could do was wait and brace himself for whatever came next. The hours that followed felt like an eternity for Greg. After the initial confrontation in the security office, he was left to stew in his own thoughts, sitting alone in a small holding room with nothing but 4 bare walls and the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. The officers had confiscated his phone, leaving him disconnected from the outside world and completely unprepared for what awaited him. It wasn't long before another knock came at the door. This time, it was a representative from Greg's embassy who entered, looking both concerned and frustrated. The man introduced himself as Mr. Harris and pulled up a chair across from Greg. I need to explain your situation, he said bluntly, skipping any pleasantries. Things have gotten out of hand. Greg blinked, his mind racing. What do you mean? He asked cautiously, though deep down, he already feared the answer. Mr. Harris sighed heavily and placed his phone on the table between them. On its screen was a video, the same clip Greg had filmed earlier, now edited and shared countless times online. In the footage, Greg could clearly be seen laughing as the stray dog lunged at the guard, tossing the stick repeatedly while ignoring the growing disapproval around him. The comments section beneath the video was ablaze with outrage. Disrespectful tourist. Ban him forever. He doesn't deserve to visit our country. This has gone viral, Mr. Harris explained grimly. Locals are furious, and so is the royal family. They're demanding accountability. You've become a symbol of disrespect, not just here, but internationally. Greg's face flushed with shame as he stared at the screen. He hadn't realized how quickly his actions would spiral out of control. Back home, people often joked about pushing boundaries or bending rules when traveling. But this was different. His reckless prank had struck a nerve in a nation deeply proud of its traditions, and the backlash was swift and severe. But there was more. Mr. Harris scrolled through additional messages on his phone, showing Greg articles written by local journalists. One headline read, "Tourist mocks Royal Guard, a national insult." Another declared, "Foreign visitor faces justice after disgraceful act." Even news outlets in Greg's home country had picked up the story, painting him as a disrespectful troublemaker who thought he was above cultural norms. "The palace insists on making an example of you," Mr. Harris continued. "They want to restore dignity and send a message that such behavior won't be tolerated. That means fines, public apologies, and possibly deportation." Public apologies. Greg's stomach twisted at the thought. He hated attention under normal circumstances, let alone standing in front of cameras and angry crowds to admit his wrongdoing. But as much as he wanted to protest, he knew he didn't have a leg to stand on. His actions spoke louder than any excuse he could muster. To make matters worse, word had spread back home too. Friends and acquaintances were tagging him in social media posts, sharing memes mocking his antics. Some even accused him of embarrassing their entire community. Messages poured into his inbox, some sympathetic, others scathing, but all reminding him of the magnitude of his blunder. By the time Mr. Harris finished explaining the gravity of the situation, Greg felt utterly defeated. "What happens next?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with desperation. "You'll issue a formal apology tomorrow morning," Mr. Harris replied. "In front of the palace gates, where it all began. It's non-negotiable. If you cooperate fully, they might reduce the severity of your punishment. But if you resist..." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. That night, Greg barely slept. Alone in the holding room, he replayed every moment of the day in his mind. The laughter, the barking dog, the angry crowd. What had started as a harmless prank had turned into a nightmare, one that exposed not only his recklessness, but also his ignorance of the values held dear by the people of this country. As dawn approached, Greg braced himself for what lay ahead. He knew that stepping outside those palace gates again wouldn't just be about apologizing. It would be about facing the consequences of his actions head-on. Karma had responded swiftly, and now there was no escaping it. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the palace grounds, but for Greg, it felt more like a spotlight shining brutally down on his every move. Flanked by two stern security officers and escorted by Mr. Harris from the embassy, Greg stepped out of the holding area and into the open air. His heart sank as he approached the very spot where his foolish prank had unfolded just hours earlier. A large crowd had already gathered outside the palace gates, drawn by the news of Greg's public apology. Some held banners that read, "Respect our traditions," and "Honor the Guard." Others carried phones, ready to record every word of his statement. Reporters stood nearby, microphones in hand, while camera crews adjusted their equipment. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anger and anticipation. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people recognized Greg, their eyes narrowing in disapproval. Greg swallowed hard, feeling the weight of hundreds of stares bearing down on him. He wore a plain white shirt and khakis, his usual travel attire. But today, they felt like a costume designed to make him look even smaller against the grandeur of the palace behind him. A small podium had been set up for him to speak, and as he took his place behind it, his hands trembled visibly. Mr. Harris leaned in close, offering one last piece of advice. "Keep it short, sincere, and don't try to justify what you did," he whispered urgently. "Just say you're sorry." Nodding weakly, Greg gripped the edges of the podium and cleared his throat. Cameras clicked furiously as he began to speak. "Good morning," he started, his voice shaky but audible. "I'm here today to apologize, deeply and sincerely, for my actions yesterday." He paused, glancing briefly at the sea of faces before him. Most remained impassive, though a few scowled openly. Taking a deep breath, he continued, "What I did was wrong. I showed disrespect not only to the royal guard, but also to the people of this country and your cherished traditions. I didn't understand the significance of what I was doing, and for that, I am truly sorry." His words hung in the air, met with silence. No applause, no cheers, just cold, unyielding stares. Greg shifted uncomfortably, aware that his apology wasn't enough to erase the damage he'd caused. He pressed on, desperate to convey some semblance of remorse. "I hope you can forgive me. I promise never to repeat such behavior, and I'll do everything I can to learn from this experience." As soon as he finished speaking, reporters fired questions at him. "Do you regret your actions? How will you prove you've changed? What message do you have for others who disrespect cultures?" Greg struggled to answer coherently, his responses muddled and hesitant. Each question felt like a jab, forcing him to confront the full extent of his humiliation. When the barrage became too much, Mr. Harris stepped in, signaling that the press conference was over. But the ordeal wasn't done yet. As Greg stepped away from the podium, members of the crowd began shouting their thoughts. "You should be ashamed," one man yelled. "Go back home and stay there," cried another. A woman holding her child's hand shook her head in disgust, muttering loud enough for Greg to hear, "This is why tourists give us a bad name." Security quickly ushered Greg back toward the palace compound, shielding him from the jeers and insults. But the sting of those words lingered long after the doors closed behind him. For the first time in his life, Greg understood what it meant to feel utterly humiliated, not just by strangers, but by himself. Later that day, images of his apology went viral, spreading across global platforms. While some praised him for owning up to his mistakes, most comments were far less forgiving. Memes mocking his awkward demeanor during the apology flooded social media, turning him into a laughingstock. Friends stopped responding to his messages, and acquaintances distanced themselves, embarrassed to be associated with someone labeled as the disrespectful tourist. By evening, Greg sat alone in his temporary quarters, scrolling through the endless backlash online. Every meme, comment, and headline served as a reminder of how recklessly he had acted, and how karma had delivered its verdict swiftly and mercilessly. Though the formal punishments were still pending, the court of public opinion had already sentenced him to a lifetime of shame. Deported within days of his public apology, Greg returned to his home country carrying nothing but a suitcase and the crushing weight of his mistakes. The journey back was silent and suffocating. The stares from fellow passengers on the plane told him that his face had become infamous, even outside the borders of the nation he defended. News outlets in his own country had picked up the story too, painting him as a cautionary tale for travelers everywhere. Friends avoided him. Coworkers whispered behind his back, and strangers recognized him on the street, pointing or shaking their heads in disappointment. At first, Greg tried to retreat into isolation. He avoided social media, stopped answering calls, and spent most of his days cooped up in his small apartment, staring blankly at the walls. But no amount of hiding could silence the voices in his head, the angry shouts of the crowd, the scathing comments online, the cold indifference of the royal guard he had mocked. Every memory felt like a fresh wound, reopening the shame he thought he'd left behind. One afternoon, while endlessly wandering through his neighborhood, Greg stumbled upon a local animal shelter. Its sign read, "Second chances for all." Something about those words struck a chord deep within him. For weeks, he'd been consumed by guilt, replaying the image of the scruffy dog he'd exploited for his prank. That poor creature hadn't asked to be part of his reckless game. It had simply responded to Greg's taunts, unaware of the chaos it would unleash. On impulse, Greg decided to step inside. The shelter was warm and bustling with activity. Volunteers moved between kennels, feeding dogs, cleaning cages, and comforting frightened animals. A friendly staff member greeted Greg and offered a tour. As they walked past rows of wagging tails and hopeful eyes, Greg felt an unexpected pang of emotion. These animals, many abandoned or mistreated, were searching for redemption just like him. They deserved kindness and care, something Greg realized he had failed to show during his ill-fated trip. Inspired, Greg began volunteering regularly at the shelter. At first, it was awkward. Some volunteers recognized him from the news and gave him wary looks, unsure if he could truly change. But over time, his dedication won them over. He walked the dogs, cleaned their living spaces, and helped organize adoption events. Slowly but surely, Greg found purpose in caring for creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a way to make amends for his thoughtless actions. The work also forced Greg to reflect on his behavior. Why had he acted so recklessly? What drove him to mock traditions and people he didn't understand? Through conversations with other volunteers, he began to see how arrogance and ignorance had blinded him. Traveling wasn't about seeking thrills or bending rules. It was about learning, respecting, and appreciating the world beyond your own bubble. Months passed, and Greg grew more committed to turning his life around. He started reading about cultural sensitivity and global customs, determined never to repeat his mistakes. He reached out to organizations promoting responsible tourism, offering to share his story as a warning to others. Though many rejected his initial attempts, a few agreed to let him speak at community events or schools. Standing before audiences, Greg recounted his misdeeds honestly, acknowledging the harm he'd caused and urging others to approach new cultures with humility and respect. These talks weren't easy. Some attendees heckled him, calling him a hypocrite or questioning whether he truly regretted his actions. Others listened quietly, leaving without comment. But occasionally, someone would approach him afterward to thank him for sharing his experience. "I'll think twice before I act without considering the impact," one young traveler told him after a presentation. Those moments kept Greg going, reminding him that even flawed people can inspire positive change. Still, forgiveness remained elusive. Back in the country where his prank had unfolded, resentment toward him lingered. Social media posts continued to pop up whenever someone mentioned disrespectful tourists. And though Greg hoped the royal family might someday hear of his efforts to redeem himself, he knew better than to expect absolution. Redemption wasn't something handed to you. It was something you earned, day by difficult day. As months turned into years, Greg came to accept that his past would always follow him. But instead of letting it define him, he chose to use it as fuel for growth. His journey wasn't perfect, nor was it quick, but it was real. And in helping others avoid the same pitfalls, Greg finally found a glimmer of peace amidst the wreckage of his mistakes. Years had passed since Greg's infamous prank, but the memory of that day continued to shape his life in ways he never could have imagined. What started as a reckless act of arrogance had transformed him into someone who understood the true meaning of accountability and growth. Though the scars of his past remained, they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he had come and how much farther he still needed to go. Greg eventually moved to a quieter town where fewer people recognized him. There, he dedicated himself fully to volunteering at the animal shelter, which became his second home. Over time, he earned the trust of both the staff and the animals. His favorite companion was a scruffy mutt named Max, who reminded him of the stray dog from that fateful day. Max had been abandoned by his previous owners, wary of humans and reluctant to trust anyone. But Greg patiently worked with him, earning his affection little by little. In many ways, Max mirrored Greg's own journey toward redemption. Slow, imperfect, but ultimately hopeful. Word of Greg's transformation began to spread locally. Neighbors noticed his commitment to the shelter and his efforts to educate others about responsible behavior. One day, a local newspaper featured him in a small article titled, "From Mistakes to Meaningful Change." The piece highlighted his volunteer work and his willingness to speak openly about his past. While some readers dismissed it as too little, too late, others admired his honesty and perseverance. For the first time in years, Greg felt a flicker of pride, not for who he used to be, but for who he was becoming. Despite this progress, Greg knew he couldn't undo the damage he caused. The country he once visited still banned him from entering, and its citizens likely wouldn't forgive him anytime soon. Occasionally, he would scroll through social media and see memes or comments mocking him, reigniting old feelings of shame. But instead of letting bitterness consume him, he channeled those emotions into action. He started writing letters to embassies and cultural organizations, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about respecting traditions and understanding different perspectives. Some ignored his messages, but others welcomed them, incorporating his narrative into workshops and seminars for travelers. One day, while preparing for another community talk, Greg received an unexpected email. It was from a journalist based in the country where everything had gone wrong. She explained that she was working on a documentary series about cultural misunderstandings and wanted to interview Greg for one of the episodes. Her tone was professional yet kind, acknowledging his efforts to make amends without excusing his original actions. Greg hesitated before responding. Part of him feared reopening old wounds, but another part, a stronger, braver part, knew this might be his chance to address the people he had hurt directly. After consulting with Mr. Harris, who had stayed in touch over the years, Greg agreed to participate. The interview took place via video call, with Greg sitting nervously in his modest living room. On the other end of the screen was the journalist, along with two members of the royal administration, who listened intently as Greg recounted his story. He spoke candidly about his ignorance, his regret, and the lessons he had learned since then. When asked what message he wanted to share with viewers, Greg replied simply, "Respect is not just a word. It's a responsibility. And when we forget that, we risk losing something far greater than ourselves." To his surprise, the documentary aired to positive feedback in the very country he had offended. Many viewers appreciated his sincerity, though some remained skeptical. Still, for the first time in years, Greg allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he had planted a seed of forgiveness. Though redemption was never guaranteed, Greg found solace in knowing he had done everything in his power to right his wrongs. He couldn't rewrite history, but he could shape the future, one kind act, one lesson shared, and one wagging tail at a time. And as he walked Max through the park each evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and orange, Greg realized that sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the most meaningful destinations.